Good afternoon. I am the Reverend Dr. Camille LeBron Powell, the pastor here at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church. We are a congregation that welcomes all people regardless of age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, economic situation, family status, mental or physical abilities, to be a part of the membership and ministry of the church. We are inspired and guided by Christ's vision of God's realm, one that includes all who seek to love God and neighbor. And so we welcome all of each of you. We are excited this afternoon to welcome the Reverend Dr. William Yu. He's going to be speaking tonight about his book, What Kind of Christianity? At the end of his talk, he'll have some time for questions and answers, and then we'll have a reception in Hefner Hall right down here where you'll get a chance to greet him. Well, I just wanted to share a little introduction to him. I was introduced to Dr. Yu when I returned to school after an 18-year break for my Doctor of Ministry program, and the Jan term class in 2020, The History of Race Migration and the Making of the American Church. And for someone who admittedly took the bare minimum of church history classes my first go-round of seminary, you really got me hooked on church history because it was engaging and challenging and relevant and practical, and the class was very fun, which is hard to say for subject matter like that. And I'll tell you, there was a fun little Easter egg we looked for each day. If you know what Easter eggs, little hidden things, check out his lapel and see if you can figure out. Most days he would come in with a button or something that had to do with the topic of the day or something going on in the world, and I see he's got something on his lapel today. See if you can notice what it is. But I really appreciated his leadership of that class and the way he got us involved in the topic. Now, a little bit about Dr. Yu. He is an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Peace USA. He is a professor at Columbia Theological Seminary, the associate professor of American Religious and Cultural History, been there since 2014, and is the director of the MDiv program. And he is not afraid to mention that seminary in this book and tell the truth about its history. And his intent in telling this history is that hopefully a deeper engagement in this history is not meant to instill fear or shame us, but to help us be more faithful and effective now as we participate in the present witness of exhibiting God's kingdom, of exhibiting God's love and justice and grace in this world. And he shares his life with his spouse and his 2 teenage kids and a couple cats, which sounds familiar to me. And we are grateful to have him here this afternoon and look forward to hearing from him. So I'm going to turn it over to you. There you go.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. I'm very grateful to Pastor Camille. I'm very grateful to Laverne, both who I have firsthand knowledge of their brilliance and their just deft theological thinking that combines like a sharp mind with a big heart, and also a body that wants to move and do things that are good for justice and good for the love of God, as I've experienced both of them in the classroom. So now it is a blessing to be here at St. Andrew's Presbyterian, they often saw me at the place where I worked. I never saw them at the place where they worked. So this is a wonderful kind of mutuality thing. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book and also share briefly some research for a manuscript that I completed in early February that is scheduled for publication with Westminster John Knox Press, the same press that published What Kind of Christianity. I've heard end of January 2025. These things, academic publishing, it does take roughly 9 to 12 months, and so that's, at least as of now, where that is. But let me turn on the slides here, I think, that you can see. So I begin the book with not someone from the 18th or 19th century, but someone from the 20th and 21st century, one of the leading Presbyterian thinkers and theologians of our generation, the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who identified as a womanist, theologian, and ethicist, and who was the first African-American woman to be ordained as a Presbyterian minister of the Word and Sacrament in 1974. She once asked, and I believe she asked this and wrote this in 1987, quote, "Where was the church and the Christian believers when black women and black men, black boys and black girls were being raped, sexually abused, lynched, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to blacks, these same rights which had been given to others without question?" End quote. So that was the question that motivated and haunted and inspired and propelled me in wanting to write this history. I wanted to understand what kind of Christianity permitted and participated in the ongoing perpetuation of slavery and anti-black racism, but also to look at those Presbyterians who supported black liberation and abolition. So I found, and this is, I believe, from chapter 5 in the book, in 1835, the Reverend Samuel Joseph May, a white abolitionist working with the New England Anti-Slavery Society, he encountered a white merchant at a Presbyterian church on Houston or Houston Street in New York City. And so there was an abolitionist talk going on at this church. And again, not that surprising in that Presbyterian churches in New York City, certainly some were complicit and supportive of slavery, but others also were places where the abolitionists found momentum and found mobilization. So this merchant asked May, "Hey, can we walk out of the church and can we talk together so that we could talk more freely?" And once outside on the street, the merchant explained, "Mr. May, we are not such fools as not to know that slavery is a great evil, a great wrong. So we agree with you, abolitionists. You're trying to convince the broader white American public about the sins and the evils of slavery. But it was consented to by the founders of our republic. It was provided for in the Constitution of our Union. A great portion of the property of the Southerners is invested under its sanction, and the business of the North, as well as the South, has become adjusted to it." The merchant shared that his opposition to abolitionists like May, therefore, was not over a matter of principle, but rather revolved around the matter of business necessity. So you are kind of coming at us with moral and ethical and religious arguments. And we don't, at least for him, this merchant was saying, I actually don't disagree. Like, we don't need to have an ethical, moral debate. But I am sharing with you that there is an economic consideration. And this economic consideration that also is a political consideration, the preservation of the Union, the United States, that is where we disagree. And so that's what's happening here. In 1837, the white Presbyterian abolitionist, and who was a wealthy, a part of a wealthy family, landowning family in New York, Gerrit Smith, he therefore explained that a large proportion of white Christians in the northern states refused to take a stand against slavery. He understood it as for economic and social reasons. Slavery was a foundational reality in their lives, and they preferred the world as they knew it, even with the many evils of slavery and anti-black prejudice, over the uncertainties of deconstructing their world, which may have also led to a deconstruction of the United States, and reconstructing it in closer accordance with the teachings of Jesus Christ. Smith therefore argued that the response of white Christians to slavery therefore revealed that the governing principle of their faith was, and this was an interesting phrase for me, the doctrine of expediency. And so this was how they understood it and what was happening. And so another thing, I don't want to veer off my prepared remarks too much, because then I get a little too much, but I will say part of what I've demonstrated in the book, and I do observe this historically, is that I think some of us, or even how it's taught, maybe not taught, because it's not really taught at all, but it is the notion that initially in 1619, and then in 1720, and then in 1770s, 1780s, the Constitutional Convention, they didn't know better. They didn't realize how wrong slavery was. And increasingly, as they understood how wrong slavery was, it chipped away at the pro-slavery convictions and thoughts and mindsets of kind of white Americans. But actually, when you look at pro-slavery, when you look at it as a movement, and you look at it, sadly, as a theology, it actually doesn't go this way, but it goes this way, in that more pro-slavery literature was written after 1830 than before. Because in some ways, Samuel J. May, Gerrit Smith, and other abolitionists, including, and I'll get to them, Theodore Wright and Samuel Eli Cornish, and black abolitionists too, as they got more published and as they became more active and more organized, what's known as the second wave of the abolition movement after 1830, that resulted in more pro-slavery propaganda, more pro-slavery theology, more pro-slavery sermons. In that, and why were so much of the pro-slavery, why was so much of the movement religious and theological? And in large part it was because the abolition movement had moral and theological arguments. They appealed to the Bible. Frederick Douglass, for example, appealed to Luke chapter 4 and said, this is the Jesus that is true and righteous and just. It was the one who proclaimed, the Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is upon me to proclaim good news to the poor, liberty for the captive, sight to the blind, freedom for the oppressed. This is the Jesus Christ that we abolitionists are appealing to. This is why we think we're right, and this is why slavery should be abolished. And in response, certainly, moral and religious arguments required moral and religious counters. So, and I'll get to it in some ways. So that's in one way why this economic argument, though it was an argument that likely many people knew, that it was not the chief argument that pro-slavery advocates used. So we're kind of going there. And so this doctrine of expediency, I find one sad and shameful example of expediency is found in Archibald Alexander's leadership as a pastor, a seminary professor, and the moderator of the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America. I think it's in 1810. Alexander was the first, I think, called professor of Princeton Theological Seminary, roughly in 1812. And he taught there for, I think, spanning 4 decades, 40 years or so. And he, while he was teaching at Princeton Seminary, endorsed the American Colonization Society, a movement centered in the northern states that endeavored to send free African Americans to Liberia, because Alexander felt that the discriminatory contempt white Christians held against black Americans in the northern states was too insurmountable to overcome. In 1846, Alexander wrote that anti-black racism was wrong, but he didn't commit to working toward racial equality. Instead of teaching white Christians to repent of their sins of racial discrimination, Alexander prescribed that black Americans, those who were emancipated and those he hoped and prayed would be emancipated one day, leave the country of the United States and find another home on the African continent where their skin color would not be so despised. Alexander even writes in that 1846 book, if I were a colored man, and I'm going to use the language and even some of the gender-exclusive language that he and others wrote in then. If I were a colored man, I too would leave this country where my manhood and my fullness could never be realized because of all the obstacles and discrimination because of my skin color. So I would go to Africa where my skin color would not be a detriment to me kind of living into my full manhood. This was one of his arguments. And this was also, for the abolitionists, one of their great challenges to black liberation. Of course, the greatest challenge was pro-slavery and the ongoing practice and perpetuation of slavery. But for many of them, they found this other challenge in colonization, that the solution to slavery was not emancipation, liberation, and equal rights and civil rights, but the solution to slavery was colonization. And this very expensive and impractical and illogical movement to somehow migrate and transport millions of African Americans, some of whom had more lineage and ancestry in the United States than more recent immigrants from Europe to Africa. For some of them, it wasn't going back home to Africa, for they had multiple generations of family in the United States. And this too, the colonizationists, as they were known, they wrestled with this and they acknowledged this, but ultimately it was this idea that, again, that white prejudice against black people was so strong and so fierce, they did not think it could be overcome while African Americans resided in the United States. Theodore S. Wright, a black Presbyterian pastor in New York City, who was the first black graduate of Princeton Seminary, class of 1828. He helped to lead black opposition to the colonization movement. Wright co-authored with one of his mentors and another Presbyterian pastor, Samuel Eli Cornish. Cornish was also one of the co-founders of the first African-American newspaper in 1825 or 28, Freedom's Journal. And together they published an essay rebutting several of the main thrusts of the colonization movement, saying, hey, this is immoral, this is irrational, and most importantly, this is anti-Christian. So they began with a searing rebuke of the exclusively white membership of the American Colonization Society, or ACS. The ACS was an organization professing to work on behalf of the interests of black persons, but it did not consult or include any black persons in its work. One of their reasons, they said, is that they did not want to be misunderstood as an abolitionist society. And so they did not want to be associated in leadership with black people because they understood that that was what black Americans wanted. And they were saying, that's not what we're trying to do. They wanted to be an outlet for those, through persuasion, white Southern enslavers who wanted to free their enslaved persons, that there was a kind of an option that they could free them, and with support, financial support with the ACS, facilitate their migration to Liberia. So therefore, what happened, according to Cornish and Wright and other black Americans, is that the ACS propagated racist and false ideas that black Americans universally denounced. ACS members, according to Cornish and Wright, falsely claimed that black Americans, quote, yearned in their hearts for Africa. This really bothered Wright and Cornish. You all keep saying what we desire and what we yearn for in our hearts is Africa. So you, philanthropists and wealthy white people, help us make black people's dreams come true. This is what they want. They want to go home to Africa. If only you would, make a pledge and make a donation to help us make that possible. While not saying, part of it is, there is a lot of territory, and we'll get into, we won't today get into the settler colonial problems of some of this westward territory, but Robert Finley, Princeton graduate who was one of the leaders of the ACS, he conceded that, because some would say, why Liberia across the Atlantic Ocean? Why not some of this westward territory? Why not present day, for example, Colorado or some of the other Louisiana purchased land? And he conceded. He said that will not drum up enough support among white people, particularly white supporters of slavery, because then that will be seen as a temptation and a haven that enslaved black people might want to escape to. And it might create a strong black community in the United States or in North America, which was what was not of interest. So that's another reason, partly why Liberia. And Cornish and Wright also countered that if we were consulted, if black Americans like us were genuinely consulted, what we would tell the ACS is that what we yearn for in our hearts was equal rights and equal access to education and employment in the United States. Would you all be willing to help us with that? Cornish and Wright also challenged the ACS for accommodating rather than combating the anti-black racism of white Christians. They charged the ACS with promoting a powerless gospel that surrendered to anti-black racism as an unconquerable sin. I think this is really smart of them. They took the racial claims of the ACS to their theological conclusion. They wrote at one part of their essay, quote, "To this end, there is in the white man an inherent prejudice against his colored brother, so fixed that its removal, whilst the latter remains in this country, is not only beyond all human power, but beyond Christianity itself, the power of God. But that it might surely be mitigated at least, if not extinguished, provided the Atlantic Ocean could be made to roll between them. So they're making a really smart claim here. They're saying to all the white supporters of the ACS, like, how big is your God? What is your God capable, right? All things are possible to him who believes. What do you believe in? How do you believe? Who do you believe in? And their argument, time and time again, the solution to anti-black racism was the repentance of white Christians, not the removal of black Americans. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison, not the most significant abolitionist, but probably the most well-known abolitionist in American memory today. He wrote in the inaugural issue of his abolitionist newspaper, which became the most well-known newspaper, The Liberator. And in part, he, as a younger man, thought colonization could be a possibility, or that it was at least a worthy movement to support alongside liberation. And then in 1832, he wrote Thoughts on African Colonization, where he says, no, this is totally a farce, and this is sin, and this is wrong. But so in 1831, he's writing January 1st, his new newspaper, and he explained that the aim of my newspaper is to, quote, strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population, end quote, adding that he would not apologize for his use of abrasive and accusatory language, which some, if not many, white Christians, particularly those in the mainstream denominations, such as Presbyterians and Methodists, they found Garrison to be inflammatory and un-Christ-like. They said, Garrison, you're one of the greatest dangers to Christianity and Christian witness in the United States because you are creating such division. There is unity and harmony in the spirit and the love of Christ. You keep attacking Christians and denominations and churches with vitriol and with anger and with rage but he was saying, because you all continue to support and not do enough about slavery. So Garrison said, I deem it necessary to be as harsh as truth. And he hated the kind of Christianity that appealed to gradual abolition, that we're going to pray about it and it's going to happen someday. He hated African colonization and other moderate compromises. And I write in the first chapter of the book, one portion of his first inaugural editorial, quote, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hand of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. But what I find in this institutional or denominational history of American Presbyterians is that white Presbyterians would not relent in prioritizing ecclesial unity over black liberation. So the commissioners, and this is from chapter 5, I believe, at the PCUSA Old School General Assembly. I write in the book, I know many of you have read it, about the Old School, New School split in 1837. So this is the larger group, the Old School General Assembly. They're meeting in Cincinnati in 1845. And they understood that the actions and schisms among Baptists and Methodists in 1844 and 45 made it nearly impossible for them to further prevent or postpone a decision on slavery. So again, in 1836, they did have this motion that passed at that General Assembly in Pittsburgh. We're going to indefinitely postpone any discussion on slavery. And in some way, in my current manuscript, it does mirror what was happening even in the House of Representatives in the U.S. Congress, where they also had a similar motion to table all discussion and legislation on slavery. And that lasted roughly 8-9 years as well. And it became known as the gag rule. And that comes from John Quincy Adams. He was the president of the United States from Massachusetts, lost to Andrew Jackson in 1828. And then I think a little bit after that, he became I don't think presidents do this anymore, but he became a congressman representing his district in Massachusetts and returned to DC. And he supported the abolitionist movement. And he did say, for us to table all discussion on this and that we're not even able to talk about it in the hallowed and the halls of legislation, it is as if you were putting a gag in my mouth, preventing me from speaking. And so Presbyterians did have this kind of gag rule, and they realized it won't hold anymore. when they saw what was happening in the other denominations and their splits, Southern Baptists and Northern Baptists, and same thing with the Methodists, although it was known as the Methodist Episcopal Church, the MEC, and the Methodist Episcopal Church, South, the MECS. For the Southern Methodists. I will find, though, that the Northern Methodists, despite this split, they did not enforce strongly their anti-slavery convictions in the border states, such as Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, because they wanted to retain their churches in their fellowship. But this was happening here, and so, all right, they're meeting together in Cincinnati, and they realize that we're going to have to do something. So, as Presbyterians are wont to do, a special committee was appointed on the third day of the proceedings, and they would make a recommendation that the floor of the General Assembly would vote on. As the committee met to prepare their report, its members agreed that church unity was to be the most important commitment, and they consulted with several commissioners from the southern states. James Henley Thornwell, an elected commissioner from the Charleston Presbytery and a professor of biblical studies and theology at the then South Carolina College, which is now University of South Carolina. He emerged as one of the leading voices in these gatherings. Thornwell was respected as one of the brightest thinkers among white Presbyterians in the southern states. 1847, he was one of the founding editors of Southern Presbyterian Review, a pretty big deal like Theological Journal, and he joined the faculty of Columbia Seminary in 1855. He wrote his wife, Nancy Witherspoon Thornwell, from Cincinnati, to share about his crucial work staving off the implementation of a firmer position against black enslavement. He wrote to his beloved wife, and he did often write at the beginning, "My beloved wife," or "my dearest." The question of slavery has been before the House and referred to a special committee of 7. Though not a member of the committee, I have been consulted on the subject and have drawn up a paper, which I think the committee and the assembly will substantially adopt. And if they do, abolitionism will be killed in the Presbyterian Church, at least for the present. Thornwell's paper, which the committee advanced as its own, emphasized the spirituality of the church, which meant that the General Assembly's jurisdiction pertained only to the moral conduct and religious faith of its members. Presbyterians, according to Thornwell, not permitted to legislate where Christ has not legislated. Thornwell devised a way to reorient abolitionist appeals into a single question that was less about the sins of slavery and more about interpretations of the doctrine of scriptural or biblical authority. The committee recommended that the General Assembly address the following question. Quote, "Do the scriptures teach that the holding of slaves without regard to circumstances is a sin, the renunciation of which should be made a condition of membership in the Church of Christ?" So this is how we're going to solve it. By presenting the decision on slavery in this matter, you can see there, Thornwell built on kind of earlier contentions from the 1830s that Presbyterians lacked the authority to go against a literal interpretation of the Bible. So again, what was challenging here is that how could it be that slavery was not a matter of religious faith and moral conduct, or rather that it was a civil and political matter that had no bearing on like the church's authority to govern over spiritual matters? That was kind of how it worked. It was odd because political matters, like what was political and what was a human rights issue and what was Christian, it always remained in flux then and even now. For example, to preach on slavery was not permitted, but to preach in support of temperance, the move to abolish the sales of alcohol, that was, although that required political legislation and advocacy to happen, that was permissible. It was permissible to preach against the women's rights movement. That was allowed from the pulpit, but slavery was not. This is one of the challenges between like what is a political issue from the pulpit and what is a justice issue or a human rights issue. That and largely, that comes to the determination of the discerning community. The community actually interprets what is political and what is not. And so that's what's happening here. But Thornwell did succeed in shaping a consensus among white Presbyterians that slavery was a civil matter outside of the church's authority. The commissioners at that General Assembly almost unanimously sided with Thornwell. And I have the votes from the minutes of 1845 General Assembly, 168 to 13 with 3 abstentions. Thornwell also exulted to his wife, Nancy, about the significance of defeating abolitionist efforts in Cincinnati, a city that he called and what was known as a stronghold of abolitionism because of the formidable presence of anti-slavery activists there. Thornwell didn't receive any public recognitions of his leadership because he wasn't a formal member of the special committee, but he got a greater honor 2 years later in 1847. I think it was in Richmond when the General Assembly met there, when he was elected moderator of the General Assembly at the young age of 34. Which made him, to that point, the youngest person to ever hold that position. So that's what was going on there. And again, my point there in sharing all this is the deliberation, the work, the behind-the-scenes activity, all of the work that these Presbyterian men and that these leaders had to do to have the Presbyterian Church maintain a pro-slavery, or what some of them like to call a moderate position. Like, it didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because, they just didn't know what to do. Slavery was a problem that was too hard, a dilemma too hard to solve. They actually worked very hard to come up with positions that did not say that much. It was not because they did not have much to say. It's not because they didn't understand what was happening. I do think some of us are comforted by attributing and interpreting the past as problems of ignorance. They didn't know better, rather than problems of immorality. Ignorance comforts us in a way that immorality does not. They were just so stupid back then in the 1840s. They didn't understand this issue and that issue. And in some ways, I get it. For one of the things, for example, is certainly they did not have scientific understandings of pregnancy and birth control. That is true. That's why many of the families were very large. But in this regard, they did have understanding of what was at stake when churches met and discerned what to do about slavery. And they did have an understanding of what it meant to be one of the 3 largest denominations in the United States as Presbyterians. So in his survey, I'm almost done, I promise, of pro-slavery literature, Kenneth M. Stamp, from roughly actually the civil rights era, I think he published this book in the 1950s, this kind of new wave of historians studying slavery in ways that were trying to get away from, sadly, the real failures of Reconstruction to grapple honestly with slavery and its history and getting at it. And he finds that pro-slavery writers, in his estimation, they actually didn't deploy the most persuasive argument in their arsenal enough. When he looks back and looks at all the primary source documents, I looked at some of them, he wonders why they didn't use economic arguments more. He says, the religious arguments like those from James Henley Thornwell, they were actually disputable. You could go one way or the other. You can interpret the Bible one way or the other. But in the 1850s, he argues it was clear that, quote, the slave was earning for his owner a substantial, though varying surplus above the cost of maintenance, end quote. And that slavery continued to produce significant financial gains for many white persons, not just enslavers, throughout the southern and northern states. Again, my argument is that they didn't use the economic argument as much because the abolitionists were not using primarily economic arguments. They were primarily, I don't want to say it was totally like a Christian tradition and movement, but it largely appealed to the Bible and theology and Christian resources to proclaim that slavery was wrong and it needed to be abolished immediately. In 1853, I write about him a little bit in the book, but not this part. The formerly enslaved black abolitionist and author William Wells Brown, I think I end the first chapter of my book with his autobiography and his recollection of what it was to be owned by a Presbyterian man. And he says, in Missouri, he says, I met the pastor a few times, and I don't think my master taught, I don't think he taught any theology to my master. but I think my master taught theology to him. And he writes really beautifully and sadly and powerfully. When the pastor of the church that his enslaver went to, when the people in the pews, when they wanted a story, the pastor, he told them a story. When they wanted a song, the pastor, he sung them a song. I don't think he taught my master anything. In fact, and this is how I end chapter 1, my master taught theology to him. It really is. He's a brilliant writer. But anyways, he's writing, and now he's in England. He's escaped slavery through the help of a Quaker couple in Ohio initially, and he's in England, and he's like Frederick Douglass and others. He's found a new life, and he's working hard to engage in abolitionist activism. And he writes a letter to his friend William Lloyd Garrison, and he expresses encouragement for the support that he was finding in London. But he said, you know what really frustrates me here is when the white American pastors come to visit. Brown bitterly complained that the pastors who visited England advocated moderate anti-slavery views, emphasizing patience, compromise, forbearance, and all that both he and William Lloyd Garrison despised and found counterproductive to the cause of black liberation. He even is angry at, I think his name is Calvin Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe's husband. That when he came once and William Wells Brown hears him speak, he says, what is this talk that is not speaking the truth about what slavery is and why it needs to be abolished? Throughout Garrison's life, he too answered his Christian critics, which included a good number of Presbyterian clergy, by pointing them to the example of Jesus. In 1838, Garrison wrote in The Liberator, "If you would make progress, you must create opposition. If you promote peace on earth, array the father against the son and the mother against the daughter. If you would save your reputation, lose it. It is a gospel paradox, but nevertheless true. The more peaceable a man becomes after the pattern of Christ, the more he is inclined to make a disturbance, to be aggressive, to turn the world upside down." He says it's the gospel paradox, but he says this is what I think it believes. This is what I believe it means to be Christian. And of course, slavery is such a difficult sin to abolish and eradicate because it has become a foundational sin in our country, the United States. And those are the sins that are the hardest to remove. And he surveys world history and looks at other cultures and says, look at some of their sins and the way they're ingrained in their communities and their cultures. That's why they're so hard to abolish. Slavery and anti-black racism is ours. And so that's why it is going to take a revolution. It is going to take significant work and effort for us to abolish this sin. We are going to have to turn the world upside down. There is no other way. You can't chip away at a foundational sin. It needs to be uprooted. Garrison later added that his tactics were the same actually as the early modern Protestant reformers. He was a non-denominational Christian, but he said, hey, you guys, the reformers, you guys love like Luther and Calvin, right? They're your guys. And he said, John Knox too. You love these guys. He says, I love them too. And why I love them is that they exhibit that every great reform movement must display antagonism to public quietude and good order and make the whole social, political, and religious structure tremble to its foundation. Garrison found inspiration from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 9 to 12, because he too desired to be a repairer of the breach and a restorer of paths to dwell in, which he claimed was not possible unless one also was willing to be a disturber of the peace. You cannot be a restorer, you cannot be a repairer unless you are willing to be a disturber. And so this was his call, and this was again in Isaiah 58. It is to undo heavy burdens, to break every yoke, to repair the breach, and to restore the streets of the dwelling. Even in his private correspondence, I found, it's published letters from William Lloyd Garrison. It is quite moving. He would often end his letters to break every yoke, comma, William Lloyd Garrison. This is what he understood about Christianity. And sometimes even those abolitionists who were supportive of him, they did find him quite radical. Harriet Beecher Stowe once came to him and said, are you really a Christian? How can you're just so radical, and do you believe in the Bible? And he says, I do. And he says, the answer to the question that I am always trying to answer every day is, who is my neighbor? Because I love God and I love neighbor. And this is the call, and this is what I believe needs to be done. And so I'm going to end there. I don't get to do as much on William Lloyd Garrison in this book. I do a lot more because the manuscript is a broader kind of history of abolitionism. But I just want to end there and to note that certainly there were many kinds of bad Christianity that I uncovered in the book. But I do note that there are also good kinds of Christianity too. And that's where I think my hope is that we can both be deeply honest and deeply hopeful about the past, the present, and the future. History is not a weapon that is used to conceal past sin or induce present guilt. Rather, it is a tool to help us be more responsible about repair. So I'll end there. Thanks, Pastor Camille. Thanks, Laverne. I probably went on longer than you wanted and I wanted, but that's that part.
All right, and if we have questions, I got a microphone right here. I'll come to you. Come on.
I have a question. I don't need a microphone.
Yes, you do. Everybody needs a microphone.
I was curious that you stated, and you do argue in the book, that the arguments that they made against pro-slavery were biblical rather than economic. But you do also imply, though, that the pro-slavery theologians and defenders made biblical arguments rather than economic arguments. But you do imply in the book that their motivation or incentives were economic. Is that right?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes. It is clear to me, and I think it is clear to, yes, it is, not everyone had an MBA and a finance degree in 1850. But what was clear in the same way it is clear to us today is everyone understood like the basic structures and systems of their economics. People then, they didn't have Excel, but they knew how to make money. And they knew that slavery was foundational to the economy and to well-being. Pastors knew in the southern congregations where they preached, they knew where their tithes and offerings were coming from. In the same way that pastors today know where tithes and offering is coming from. The economic arguments, in one way, they were not as pronounced because they were known. They were known to all. In the House of Representatives, James Henry Hammond, a South Carolinian congressman, I think he was also governor of the state, he did note, he kind of said, this is right leading up to this 1836 gag rule. He's like, you, especially the younger white men, like from states like Vermont, I think there was this guy, James Slade or William Slade, you come to the House and you get up when it's your turn to talk and you moralize and you chastise us all about slavery and how wrong it is, but you and I both know that you don't have an economic solution. He said, you want to do what England did when they did the Gradual Abolition Act in 1833? They provided reparation and compensation for enslavers in the Caribbean and the British Guyana, which is now Guyana in South America. And he said, if we were to do that, roughly an enslaved person, he knew it off the top of her head, much like everyone else did, $600. That is the human valuation or the financial valuation of a human being that was enslaved. Our federal government, the receipts, was $25 million. We'd probably only be able to compensate for tens of thousands of enslaved people, and there are more than 2 million enslaved persons. Until you come back here, you, like New England congressmen, until you come back here with an economic solution that works and that makes sense, stop with your moralizing. Stop with your Garrisonian speeches about how evil we are as a country and how bad we are, what bad Christians we are. So, Laverne, to your point, was the economics of slavery were understood. And that was a motivation for the explicit arguments.
So my sort of follow-up question was, how self-aware were the theologians that it really was an economic interest? Hodge, who's the other Princeton guy?
Yeah, probably
Cornwell.
likely. Again, I don't know. What is clear certainly is because one of every 3 students at Princeton University and Princeton Seminary came from southern states, from southern what they called the elite, the planter class. So certainly, though I don't have written proof, it's certainly understood. Again, the economics of how things work were understood. Perhaps not perfectly, but I would argue sufficiently. And there you have but again, there you have their biblical arguments, perhaps on top of that.
Got another one here.
I wonder, why do they want to send the slaves back to Liberia? I don't know where that comes from. Why did America have Liberia? Why didn't they want to send them back to the West African countries that they came from?
I think, so initially the desire was in some ways to imitate what Britain was doing with Sierra Leone. And again, it is to understand the western coast of Africa, or just Western Africa, and the way the nation states are today were not what it was in the 1800s and even into pre-1945. But so the desire was to, with limited American imperialism then, where they had some influence and some reach, the United States, in what became Liberia. And Monrovia, right, named after James Monroe, the capital city of that nation state. So the desire initially was this migration and transportation to Africa. And then it became, Liberia became the sphere of influence within American geopolitics, where ostensibly Black Americans could go. And so some went willingly, some went with coercion, but that is why. Largely, I mean, the number is so few when it was recognized as a failure. But I will say colonization continued to be on the table. Even Abraham Lincoln, for those of you who know our Lincoln history, that he looked at and considered, I think, present-day Panama and Central America as another site of colonization during the Civil War. And it was, even for Lincoln, the recognition of the problems of, like, white racism against the Black race that really was just known and understood. So yeah. So Lincoln, again, he is known as for some, the reluctant emancipationist. Even when he was trying to be president, right, in that 1860 election, he said, I am against the westward expansion of slavery. I am not about trying to end slavery in states that are a part of the United States. I'm against its expansion. And even when the Civil War began, he would often say, I must save the Union, and I will end slavery if I can. But save the Union, I must. And so even some abolitionists and some Christians like William Lloyd Garrison, when the war wasn't going well initially, they actually interpreted it as divine displeasure. And they tried to persuade Lincoln that we're losing the war because the moral reason is to end slavery. And then if we do that, then perhaps God will, be on our side. And Lincoln himself, though, anyways, in the second inaugural in 1865, he does admit he kind of says, we're trying to make sense of it. It's hard. Both sides pray to the same God, right? That's part of the speech. But then he says the irony of wrestling with, and each side prayed, help us kill the other, and kind of making sense of all that. But long story short, that is why colonization was desirable for some, and why Liberia.
Oh, Jane's got a question.
So I'm interested to know, do you have a vision of this radical solution for us now?
Oh, so I do.
Can you tell us?
So, okay, I do think it requires multiple layers. So one level, for me, I'll just share in my own life. It requires, at an interpersonal, relational level, working in a diverse community, not only across race and ethnicity, but across sexuality and gender identity and economics and the like. It does require me, how do I express and exhibit and practice and share the love and justice of God with everyone I meet in my neighborhood and in my workplace? And then secondly, if I have some influence and some authority in my workplace, which is Columbia Seminary, how do I help the institution be more kind of racially just and faithful and do what's right? And then it requires, at another level, thinking about churches, how churches can care deeply about inclusive worship and ministry that is just and right, not only when people come to the church, but in the world that they leave after church. Not only what it looks like on Sunday, but Monday, Tuesday, and the like. And then it also requires political engagement. And this is perhaps one of the more challenging things today. And perhaps it's always been. We exist in a two-party system in this country. So both conservative and progressive-leaning reform folks, some of us say we stand in the Augustinian tradition. Fancy way of saying what that means is that's based on Augustine's book, I think, City of God. I'm going to use a little bit of gender-exclusive language. All of us have citizenship in two cities, the city of God and the city of man, or the heavenly and the earthly city. So in the earthly city, it does require some political or temporal engagement. And it is to recognize that politics is not spiritual, it's not heavenly, but it is temporal and it's earthly. And so it's imperfect and it's messy and it's compromised, but it is necessary because it has consequences. I kind of like what Reinhold Niebuhr once said: politics is the sad business of trying to do justice in an unjust world. And so I have to engage and I have to discern politically in terms of how I'm going to advocate, how I'm going to vote for candidates and for legislation that will produce a more racially just and socially just all that world. So it is all of these multiple prongs. I need to keep being educated. I need to keep learning more. I need to do good and do right. I need to think right, and I need to advocate and figure out ways. Again, a lot of times political work is kind of holding your nose and saying, I've only got two options. I don't love option one like 1,000 times more than option two, but option one is better than option two. And I don't love everything in option one, but I'm going to go for it. The real quick example I give of this is Joe Scrivener. He's a really great pastor of Brown Memorial Presbyterian in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, a historically black Presbyterian church. He's the dean of religious life at Stillman College, the only historically black college that was founded by the Southern Presbyterian denomination in that same city, Alabama. He introduced me to this book by Matthew Desmond, Poverty by America. He's a Princeton sociologist. And Joe told me what haunted him is that Desmond, I think, pretty cogently argues that poverty is an American problem, but there are American solutions. But one thing you have to grapple with is that there are lots of inefficiencies in the bureaucracy of how it's run through the government. He finds that he thinks 22 cents of every dollar, taxpayer dollar, goes to actually helping and alleviating the most vulnerable and the people who are impoverished and unhoused and who need it the most. Only 22 cents of every dollar. That's discouraging, because 78 cents goes to a lot of middle people and goes to a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of inefficiency, or what we would say is government waste and corruption. And I'm going to bump that number up to 50 cents when I think about Medicare and Social Security and the like. And maybe I'm being a little generous. But I have to make a decision, and I study it and I think about it. One political party is saying, look at all the government waste. Look at 50 cents of every dollar isn't being used well. You can spend that dollar better than us. You, through whether it be generating the economy or charities, you deserve that dollar back. Because the government, we don't know how to, we're just going to waste your dollar, so you get it back. The other party is saying, we need two of your dollars, because $1 is not enough. So for all of us, I think one solution is we want that $1 to be used better. I'd like 70 cents of that dollar to actually go. But then ultimately, right now, where we are, I kind of have to make a decision based on $2 or $0. And so for me, what I've discerned is that even the best churches and the best charities cannot make up for the imperfect social structures and support that federal, local, and state governments provide, as imperfect and as wasteful as some of them are. So I hold my nose and say, I'm going to vote for the candidate that wants another dollar. Even though what I wish is that a candidate would say, maybe I want a little bit more, not a full dollar, and I'm going to work better at fixing what is now. That's just one example of the the many things we need to do. And so it is really challenging. So what happens though is people say, all that matters is relationship. We just have to love the people who God brings into our lives. And I say, yes, we do need to do that. But in order to love all of the people, so we don't want to be jerks and be like all like haughty and I got to figure out all the big problems. I got to read all these big books. We do need to love, but we also need to figure out how to get civically involved. Like we do, we need to get worship right. But we also need to get ministries of justice and compassion and civic involvement. We need to get that right too. In a lot of ways, more what I share with more progressive-leaning Presbyterians and other Christians is don't give up on the church and don't give up on worship. At one level, for some, I get it. I get it. You're disenchanted. You're really disgruntled and frustrated. You're like, all these people of faith care about is their worship service. I get it. Sometimes in my dark days, I feel that way too. But we have to hold on to the fact that illumination, transformation, and good things happen in worship and education that lead to the advocacy and the civic work that you want to happen. And ultimately, what is a church if not worship? We're not a PAC, a political advocacy caucus. We are a place where we're trying to meet with the divine and be illumined and be inspired so that then we can do that PAC work better.
Wow, thank you. I want you to write it all down so we can all go do that. Any other questions? We're technically out of time. I wonder, can I ask a question? Since you do actually name your employer in the book, could you mention sort of how the seminary has responded to this book? I know a little bit about some of the work they've done with scholarships and reparation type work in telling the truth about how they were founded. Could you talk a little bit about Columbia's work to do some
Oh, yeah, sure. So this is
reparative justice?
more what I can share is that, so there is a Episcopal seminary in Alexandria, Virginia, called Virginia Theological Seminary. They, like Columbia, both of our schools are among the 10 wealthiest by endowment seminaries in the United States. The wealthiest seminary is Princeton Seminary, $1.1 billion in their endowment. Harvard and Yale Divinity School, which are part of the larger universities, but their own autonomous thing, they're roughly in the 600s. Candler School of Theology at Emory, 400 or 500s. Columbia is roughly 250 million. Virginia is 200 million. Why I share all that is not to brag about wealth. But what Virginia's president discerned in 2019, I think his name is Ian Markham, New York Times has written about him. He said, look, it's clear, our record, enslaved people helped literally build our campus. Enslaved people were owned and we profited from faculty administrators, and even during Jim Crow segregation, we paid black employees less. And so, in order for us to repent and repair these things, what we need to do is we need to use some of our past money to repair relations with the descendants of these families, of these people. So we need to make every effort to find descendants. And he said, what's it going to take? And ultimately, they discerned $1.7 million, which is 1% of their endowment, a little less. And they said, we're going to do it. We're going to hire a genealogist, and we're going to just start mailing checks. And the New York Times writes about people who had no idea. And they received checks, and they said, here's your check. This year, you're going to get more, because we apologize. And his point, the president, is this isn't all the racial justice work we need to do, but these are our specific institutional sins. None of us who work at Virginia Seminary today are guilty, but we are responsible because we have inherited this wealth that comes from enslaved and discriminatory labor. And so that's one thing they did. He said, we lost some donors, but they actually found some donors too. That 1.7 earmark became 1.9 million. By 2022. And interestingly, and what I like about what they do is that the New York Times reporter finds someone, this one man, and he says, it was terrible during Jim Crow segregation. It was terrible what my family member experienced in life and at the seminary. And he says, I will never forgive that seminary. No amount of money will make me forgive that seminary. But you know what? For the seminary and the president, they're like, that wasn't why we did it. We didn't do it for